Howdy my totally as always Tubular gamers, we're back with, you guessed it, another video. So you ever go back to a classic game that you just heard amazing things about and it turns out it's full of antiquated game design and it's aged like total ass? Well, that's the subject of today's video. Games that haven't exactly aged well.
Time is a really funny thing. What we thought was good or okay at one point in time might not be as acceptable nowadays, and every type of media, shoot, everything succumbs to this at some point. I mean, you know what's gonna age poorly next? Your car, your home, and eventually your life. Okay, maybe that's a little too dark, too fast, but everything eventually succumbs to time, and video games are no different. As games continue to get made, technology continues to improve and get better and better. Sometimes going back to older games gets harder and harder. Design choices that might have made sense for the time now feel archaic and arbitrary. We view video games differently from how we did 20, 30 years ago. Our tastes change, philosophies around game design have changed, and in many cases we have better standards. So where am I going with this? Today I'm going to be discussing 20 games that in my opinion have not aged all that well, and this could be for a variety of reasons. The controls might be unintuitive, clunky, and feel dated. The progression, pacing, or navigation might be archaic and obtuse. In some cases, almost the entire game might be dated. That's what we're looking at. I want to stress first and foremost though that I am someone who loves video games old and new. I play as many old games as I do new games, and I'm not coming from a place of hate. I am coming back to these games with a modern lens and seeing how these games hold up. I can say confidently that out of these 20 games, 19 of them are still good, and oftentimes these games hold up in other aspects, but for reasons I will explain soon enough, poorly aged. I genuinely love all of these games and think, again, 19 of them are still good. What's that one game that isn't? You'll have to watch to find out. This list is in no particular order, and lastly, I'm not going to be looking at NES games. I don't think it's fair to look at NES games or anything older than that under this light. It's honestly just kind of low-hanging fruit, and I feel like it's kind of lazy to shove NES games in there. I mean, gaming was so vastly different there, it's just not really fair. I'm sure a video like this will spark plenty of debate, so let me know down below how you're feeling about this topic or these games. It was a nice comment that suggested this video to begin with.
And as always, please like, share, comment, subscribe. I got the Patreon and the super thanks. Any support is truly greatly appreciated. Seriously, thank you so much. If you even made it to this part of the video, you're awesome. Thank you. Let's get to the first game.
So the first game we're talking about today is the game that inspired this video, and that's the original Kingdom Hearts. Like I said, I think 19 of these 20 games are good. Kingdom Hearts is a good game, and Kingdom Hearts has actually aged well in several aspects. I still think the story, the writing, and the characters are actually pretty good. The voice acting is decent enough. The presentation has aged well, and the music is still really good. I have a bunch of memories of this game as a kid. I remember booting up the PS2 and playing through this game on a summer break, and that's a great memory I'll always have. But coming back to this game in the modern era, yeah, Kingdom Hearts has not aged well in a few aspects, and all of it has to do with the core gameplay. The combat in this game just hasn't aged all that well. It's clunky, it's slow, Sora feels incredibly sluggish, the whole Keyblade swinging feels rather awkward, and the battles just don't have a great pace to them. Again, Sora just feels incredibly sluggish, not just with the Keyblade, but casting spells can feel rather slow as well, and legit every other Kingdom Hearts game has much faster, better combat than this game. This game just feels like it's moving in slow-mo at times, and the game can actually get rather difficult because of these obstacles. The camera is also a major obstacle. It's just terrible in this game, constantly putting you in a bad position or just straight up obstructing your view. Like, the camera really does have some issues, and I feel like these issues only get amplified the further you get into the game. Like, the final few bosses are just really annoying thanks to the sluggish combat, but that's not the only aspect that I think has poorly aged. The platforming is pretty bad in this game. Like the combat, it just feels very sluggish and awkward. Like the jump itself is kind of awkward. I'd say the platforming is just kind of sloppy in this game, and some areas like the Tarzan level where it's full of platforming are just not very good. Lastly, the level design in this game is questionable. It's nowhere near as linear as Kingdom Hearts 2 and 3's levels, and there's actually a decent amount of exploration, but I feel like this kind of works against it. Instead of exploring these more open areas, you find yourself just getting lost and unsure of what you're supposed to do next. You're given a general objective, but then you just kind of wander for a little bit. Some levels like Monstro or the Alice in Wonderland stage, I remember just wandering for seemingly hours, just really unsure of where to go next or what even I was exactly supposed to do, and I feel like I'm not alone in that sentiment. And then also there's the Little Mermaid stage, and I don't think anything else needs to be said about that. Kingdom Hearts 1 is still quite a good game. It's still one of the best RPGs on the PS2, but it is aged in a number of aspects, and if you go back to play it nowadays, just keep it in mind that yeah, this game did come out in the early 2000s, treat it as such. And so I'm sure I'm going to upset plenty of people, but here we have GoldenEye from the Nintendo 64. Now, GoldenEye was obviously a revolutionary game for first-person shooters on consoles, and it has an incredible legacy. The multiplayer actually holds up insanely well also, but if you come back to this game and play the single player in the modern day, you'll see that GoldenEye, it hasn't exactly aged all that well. Well, besides the music. The music really is just goated in GoldenEye, like it is just crazy good, and we could be here all day talking about how good GoldenEye's music is. But when it comes to the actual gameplay, yeah, GoldenEye has not exactly aged the best. Obviously, the first thing to bring up is the controls. Using a Nintendo 64 controller in the modern day, yeah, it's never going to be the ideal situation, and it's a bit of a speed bump you got to get over, but if you can get over that hump, I think you're going to be just fine with GoldenEye. Outside of whenever you need to like snipe somebody or be super precise, being really precise in GoldenEye with these controls, it's just kind of difficult. That and seeing them. Unfortunately, the presentation just hasn't aged all that well. The draw distance isn't great. Sometimes stuff gets crazy blurry, and it's just difficult to see what you're even shooting at. On top of this, the frame rate can get pretty awful and can dip sometimes into the single digits. It actually makes the game way more challenging than it should be, and it can make the shooting feel even more imprecise. When it comes to the shooting, I mean, it's definitely a bit clunky, and it doesn't feel or control like a normal shooter. It definitely has a bit of a learning curve to it, but the issues don't end there. I've never been big on GoldenEye's level design. They kind of just drop you into these somewhat linear areas and just give you a few objectives and say go at it, and it's just never super clear what you're supposed to do in a lot of these levels. Time Splitters and Perfect Dark also have this issue where you're just kind of wandering around hoping you eventually find the right thing or blow up the right thing, and a few of these objectives, especially on the harder difficulties, can feel a bit obtuse. And it can be frustrating that as you're trying to figure out what you're even supposed to do in this level, you just get absolutely swarmed by enemies, especially in the later levels. GoldenEye's checkpoints are also terrible. Most times, if you die, you gotta start the whole mission over, and you can't even get any health back. You can get body armor, but your health, oh no, that's not coming back. And at times it can feel a bit overly punishing. Despite all of this, I would still say the game is good. It still is a solid first-person shooter, and it still holds up in many aspects. I mean, it's a legendary first-person shooter for a reason, and if you like the genre, I think this is one of those games everybody should try out at some point. Just know that plenty of aspects haven't aged all that well. And so here we have Mortal Kombat 1. No, not that Mortal Kombat 1, we have the original Mortal Kombat. This will be the first of a few fighting games, and I'll just immediately say that fighting games are one genre of video games that really have gotten a hell of a lot better as time has progressed, especially nowadays. Like, the fighting games we have nowadays are some of, if not the best fighting games ever. And it's really awesome to see just how far we've come when it comes to fighting games, because if you go back to the original Mortal Kombat in modern day, you'll just be like, wow, things have gotten so much better than this. While I don't think the original Mortal Kombat is a bad game, it is a game that has been pretty much obliterated by time, especially if you're not playing the multiplayer. I can say just about every aspect of this game has not aged well. The presentation, while incredibly novel and unique for the time, we look back now and yeah, it just looks kinda goofy, and it can look incredibly awkward with the real life people. The story, world, and lore of the characters are pretty basic. It really was Mortal Kombat 2 and 3 that expanded things. And then we have the actual fighting, which really has just been demolished by time. It just does not feel very good. It is incredibly stiff and awkward. Doing any kind of combos or special moves just feels so stiff and janky. Like, man, this game is really stiff. It even has a block button, which was unconventional for the time, still is, and that can feel really awkward to use. And just the movement in general is incredibly stiff. It'll take some time to get used to just how this game feels. The second and third game really do feel a hell of a lot better than this original game. Something Mortal Kombat is very well known for is the fatalities. Doing fatalities in this original game is rather difficult. You have to quickly do this string of button inputs, and it's super easy to mess up. And sure, one could argue, oh, the reward is the fatality if you do the quick button input, but man, this gets so difficult to do, and you have such a tiny window, way less than the other Mortal Kombat games. On top of this, playing through the single player is just not really fun at this point. Like, the AI just cheat like crazy, and just button read the hell out of you. They do things that are just straight up inhuman and are able to react to you perfectly. I mean, it's just the definition of button reading cheating AI. The multiplayer is still fun enough, especially since then it'll be awkward for both players, but playing through the single player in this day and age, yeah, I wouldn't say it's all that enjoyable. Obviously, Mortal Kombat left a massive legacy. I mean, it was shocking for the time, it was considered ultra violent, and it's one of the most fondly remembered fighting games of the 90s, but coming back to it nowadays, it's really easy to see just how far even Mortal Kombat 2 and 3 came from this original game. Those games are much more playable than this original one. Ooh, we got another one that might stir up the comments. We have the original Mass Effect, which actually is a pretty new game compared to most games on this list. And unlike most games on this list, I feel like it's really only aged poorly in one area. Mass Effect has aged incredibly well when it comes to its writing, its world building, its characters, and the general story, especially the dialogue. It's really well done. There's some incredibly compelling, likable characters here. I think the companions are great, and it's really great to see how everything got started in this original game. One of the main reasons Mass Effect 2 and 3 story and characters and world and all of that is as good as it is because it all got started here in the original game. All of that is phenomenal. It makes it worth playing this original game, but there is an area where Mass Effect has really not aged well, and that's the combat. The combat has not aged well in the original Mass Effect. I only played through the Mass Effect series a few years ago and immediately was like, yeah, this combat sucks. The combat in Mass Effect 2 and especially 3 is way better than anything the first game has. It still is a third-person shooter, but the shooting just feels terrible. It feels incredibly clunky. The weapons have no kick or feedback. When you shoot enemies, they just don't even react. It's not satisfying, and the weapons really just don't feel nice, like in the slightest. The cover mechanic is super awkward and just isn't very good. You can get shot through the cover. The movement and shooting in general can feel just rather imprecise and slow at times. You do get some other abilities to help you out in the combat, but this really doesn't change things. It just isn't very good. And it honestly wasn't very good for the time either. And I get it, this is a role-playing game first and foremost. I can't be out here comparing the third-person shooting in Mass Effect to like Gears of War, but it could have been a bit better than this. And playing it nowadays, you really just see that the shooting and the combat in general, it's just not very good. Despite all of that, again, the game is totally worth playing and it has a ton of upsides. It's just when you get into combat, don't expect things to be all that smooth or nice, and a lot of people recommend playing this game on the easiest difficulty just to get the combat over with. I kind of agree. The less combat you have to put up with, I think the better experience you'll have. Alright, I guess I just chose violence and chaos today because I have Super Mario Kart. Now, Super Mario Kart is still a good game, and it obviously was the start to the greatest selling racing franchise of all time. And I know plenty of people have a ton of fond memories of this game with family, loved ones, friends, etc. I'm not here to dunk on that, but what I am here to say is that if you play Super Mario Kart in the modern day, you'll see that, yeah, the game certainly has aged. First off, I want to talk about the controls. Now, obviously, they didn't have a ton of examples when it comes to the controls and the handling. There weren't really any kart racers that were like this before Super Mario Kart. They all came pretty much after, but the controls and the handling, really just the general feel of this game, it's just not very good nowadays. The karts slide all over the place, I guess kind of like real go-karts. They just feel incredibly imprecise, and the drifting, you just fly all over the place with it. And oftentimes, I just don't use the drift while I'm playing the game because I just feel like I can't corner stuff all that well with it. The drift just does not feel nice. It doesn't feel like it really adds all that much speed to your kart. So yeah, a lot of the time I just avoid drifting. Maybe that's just a skill issue, but I have never thought this game handled or felt all that good to control. Next up is the courses. Obviously, there's a ton of classic courses here, but I think we can all agree that some courses are just ass in this game. There are plenty of courses that are just kind of generic. They're somewhat dull and they feel way too similar to other courses. Can you tell me the difference between Mario Circuit 2 and 3? It's not easy to tell the difference outside of some turns. And of course, hardware was limited then and we don't have the technology that we do nowadays, but I just don't think a lot of these courses stand out. There's even a dead end on one course, which is an interesting decision, I will say. Something else worth bringing up is that the AI just blatantly cheat in this game, rubber banding like crazy, and then they'll get really good items in like first place. Even I've seen characters get stars in first place when they're already pretty in front of me, and then it just becomes basically impossible to beat them. They even get like custom items depending on which character you're racing against. You can't get those items, but they can. And you might go, oh, that's just the single player, it's not so good. Stick to just multiplayer. I don't think the multiplayer's aged all that well either. I tried playing battle mode a while ago with a friend, and both of us were just having having such a hard time seeing where the other person was unless I was like constantly stalking them. And it just kind of wrecked the pacing. Like, these battles were so long and drawn out that they just weren't even really fun. The racing in multiplayer is still fine, but yeah, you don't get to see that far in front of you thanks to the game's interesting screen setup. Look, Super Mario Kart, it's still a classic, but I'd recommend you play literally any other Mario Kart game instead of this, except for Tour. And so continuing on our chaos trend, we have Grand Theft Auto 3. Now, Grand Theft Auto 3 is a legendary game, a real trendsetter, a very influential game. And a lot, and I mean a lot, of video games owe something to GTA 3. While it wasn't the first open world game, it was really the one that set the firecrackers off. Like, there's a clear distinction between pre-Grand Theft Auto 3 open worlds and post-GTA 3 open worlds. But have you actually come back to GTA 3 recently? And I'm not talking about that re-release they did a few years ago with the awful rain. I'm talking the original game. You'll realize rather quickly that while it still is a legendary game and a good time, it has aged in a few aspects. I can say graphically, it still holds up pretty decently. I think the art style is nice. I enjoy the aesthetic, and I really like the atmosphere the original game still has. I think the music is still good, and I think the driving is actually very solid in this game still. When it comes to the gameplay, I think the driving has probably aged the best. Where this game hasn't aged all that well is with the combat, the story, the pacing, the lack of checkpoints, the difficulty, and some missions just being utterly awful. GTA 3 is pretty forward thinking in a few aspects, like how you can complete certain missions in a variety of different ways that the developers probably didn't even expect you to do, but for every mission like that, there's a mission or two that's pretty awful. And most of the missions that aren't very good in GTA 3 aren't very good because there's either water involved or a lot of on-foot combat. The on-foot combat is just incredibly clunky. The movement in general just feels rather imprecise and stiff at times, but when guns get involved and you're like locking on to enemies and shooting them, it just does not feel good, like, at all. And when you need to be really precise with your shot, like with a sniper, yeah, this just feels terrible. Like, it's not unplayable or anything like that, but it really doesn't feel nice. And I get it, they didn't have really a blueprint to go off of. I mean, there was like Siphon Filter and Winback. Those were two third-person shooters that existed before this, but this was pre-RE4, pre-Gears of War. Yeah, the shooting and combat in general when you're on foot, it's just not very good. It's not intuitive, it's the opposite of satisfying, and oftentimes it just feels really clunky and frustrating. Same goes for the awful jumping in this game, and anytime you're jumping near water, I just get shivers down my spine because you can't swim, and anytime you go near water, it really just is not a good time. And all of this makes the game way more difficult than it honestly should be, and the lack of checkpoints just makes this game feel very repetitive and frustrating, since a lot of the missions are really just go talk to somebody, go somewhere, kill someone, destroy something, leave. And while the story's okay in this game, I just don't find it anywhere near as compelling or interesting as any of the other 3D GTA games, and it just leads to the game feeling more repetitive and stale by the minute. And this is coming from someone who played GTA 3 ages ago. This was my first Grand Theft Auto, and I liked it, but I didn't love it. It wasn't until I played Vice City and San Andreas that I really loved it, and I think those games are way better than GTA 3 in several aspects. Like, GTA 3 created the blueprint, Vice City and San Andreas really perfected it. And while I think the game is still good, I'd much rather play any other 3D GTA. So for this entry, I don't just have one game, I really have almost an entire series, and that's the Fatal Fury series. So that's Fatal Fury 1, Fatal Fury 2, Fatal Fury Special, Fatal Fury 3, Road to Final Victory, Real Bout Fatal Fury, Real Bout Fatal Fury Special, and Fatal Fury Wild Ambition. If you're curious which Fatal Fury games I did not include Real Bout Fatal Fury 2 or Garou Mark of the Wolves. I think those games have actually aged pretty well, and I'm not talking about them today. But as for the 7 other games I mentioned, yeah, they've all aged poorly, really in the same ways, and it's not all that different from how Mortal Kombat 1 is aged. No, not that Mortal Kombat 1, the original Mortal Kombat 1. God, what a stupid fucking name. Like the original Mortal Kombat, it's incredibly stiff in basically all of these games. Like, we're talking ultra stiff. Doing inputs and the most basic of combos can feel painful at times. Like, it feels like the game is actively fighting you. It's not totally unplayable, but it's not far from it. It does not feel satisfying, rewarding, or nice. It feels like you just happen to pull off a combo or a special move, and it sometimes feels like luck straight up had a lot to do with it, especially in the first 2 Fatal Fury games. And some of the older Fatal Fury games have different planes where there's a background and a foreground and you can jump between them and fight, and this I just never really cared for this. Like, yeah, it's a different gimmick or unique attribute that sets it apart from its main contemporary, which is Street Fighter, but I don't think this enhances the gameplay at all. I think it just kind of dates it even further thanks to it being super clunky and really easy to abuse and spam, and the AI have no problem spamming it on you. The AI are awful in these games, especially the first two Fatal Furies where they just button read the shit out of you. It might be worse than Mortal Kombat. Beating Geese Howard in the original Fatal Fury is hard as fuck. Like, the AI just read every single move you're going to do. They find a counter, they can combo you. It's absolutely ridiculous. It gets better the further in the series you get, but it just can become absolutely infuriating as it feels like you just can't do anything to stop them. Like, they just read all of your moves, and then it's so stiff and clunky that you're just trying to even do any cool moves and they just wreck your shit. Like, call it a skill issue, but I think the original few Fatal Furies, really a lot of old SNK games, just haven't aged all that well when it comes to the controls and the feel. At least the music does slap in all of these games, so I can give them that, and the presentation is nice, but coming back all these years later, playing these games, even Wild Ambition, the only 3D Fatal Fury game, it's rough. That's all I will say, as it is rather rough, and I'd rather play Garou any day of the week. So our next game is a certified classic, and it's Conker's Bad Fur Day. Now, I don't have this game on here because, like, the jokes are inappropriate and haven't aged well or anything like that. In fact, I think that's one of the best aspects of Conker's Bad Fur Day, is that it's still funny all these years later, and it still has a great sense of humor, personality, the writing is great, the story's good, the world and atmosphere of Conker's Bad Fur Day is immaculate. Where I think this game hasn't aged all that well is certain gameplay sections. And you might be going, you're really going to include this game because a few gameplay sections kind of suck. It's not just a few, it's like half of them, to be honest. As somebody who absolutely loves this game, it's one of my favorite games of all time, I'll be the first to admit that some parts of this game just suck. Like, there's no other way to go about it. And if you've played through this game before, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The rather difficult hoverboard race where you pretty much just die if you touch anything, any underwater section, really any time you even go near water. Some of the platforming can just be really annoying. Pushing the balls of poop up the hill is annoying, but I think it's supposed to be, so I guess it works. Then when you kill the zombies, or really any part with the teddies, it just has not aged well. That whole war section, which is around like a fourth of the game I might add, is just rough. Like, especially coming back all these years later, it's easy to forget just how rough it feels, controls, and difficult it actually is. Like, we remember all of the great moments of this game, and it's hilarious all these years later, but some areas in this game can seriously just piss off. Like, when you go underwater, the controls are terrible, it's super sluggish, it's annoying, and it's just not fun, not in the slightest. The hoverboard racing, like I said, it's just overly punishing, it shouldn't be that difficult, and then the part where you kill the zombies or the part with the teddies, the shooting is terrible, the controls are terrible, it doesn't feel good, it's incredibly imprecise and awkward, and you can get just absolutely wrecked in seconds. This is one area where the remake that came out a few years later on the Xbox actually fixes this, and that feels way better. The third-person shooting in that game is good. It destroys what this game had, because this game's shooting, it's just terrible. And it's not even really due to the N64 controller, it's just incredibly unintuitive and it's not fun at the end of the day. And while the bosses are incredibly memorable and funny, I just don't really care for fighting a few of them like the Teddy's boss. In the end, Conker's Bad Fur Day, you know it's a classic, it's got so many great moments, the atmosphere's great, the humor's on point, Conker himself is a great character, but I will always just dread a few levels in this game, and it's because they just haven't aged well in the slightest. At least the humor still holds up all these years later, that's what's most important. It's Chaos O'Clock and we have Morrowind. Now, Morrowind is a good game. It's a classic. It has excellent world building, it has some good characters and stories, and it just has a very unique atmosphere that no other Elder Scrolls game has. But, like a big fat juicy round butt, Morrowind has aged pretty poorly in a few areas. And I'm not talking about just the graphics. For the time, they were decent to good, they haven't exactly aged the best, but I'm over willing to look graphics really any day of the week as long as it's still fun. When it comes to the gameplay, it's aged in a few areas. I mean, the most obvious area is the combat. The combat just sucks in this game. You're basically just rolling a dice like it's D&D, and while that is fine for many games like D&D games such as Baldur's Gate 3, that's not good for a game like Morrowind where it's in first person and the action is happening in real time, and so it just comes off as like you're just swinging and missing all the time. The combat is not satisfying, it is not fun, it is not engaging, it is a chore. It is annoying, it is slow, and it gets really repetitive. Sure, you can have projectiles and magic to try to make things better, and it does make things better, but the combat, it's just really not very good in this game. For the time, I guess that was fine, but coming back to it now, yeah, it is not aged well. Navigation is also a bit of a pain in the ass. I know there's probably plenty of people who are like, this is real navigation, no objective markers, no hints, you just gotta write things down in the little book and figure it out yourself, and you know, that's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with playing games that way. I know plenty of people do like playing games that way, but I like to find a nice balance between knowing where to go and what to do and some level of ambiguity, and this game really just leans hard on the like, you need to figure out how to do everything yourself. I don't want it like Ubisoft level where it tells you absolutely every single thing you need to do and where to do it and how to do it, but this game, it just goes a little overboard, and I just find myself getting a little lost and just totally unsure what to do in certain areas or how to proceed. And sure, there's different ways to proceed, and that's cool, and it is forward thinking where there's different solutions. I mean, I feel like Starfield could have used more of that, but this game, it just feels so obtuse and archaic at times. Like, I got no idea what the hell I'm supposed to do half the time I'm playing this game, and I just gotta look stuff up. Maybe I'm the one that's poorly aged for this. Okay, that sounded better in my head, but what I'm trying to say is maybe it's a me issue. I don't think this game is aged all that well when it comes to the gameplay, and I'm sure there's going to be plenty of people that are like, mods fix this, mods fix this. Well, I've always believed you shouldn't need mods to fix the game. The game should be good, and mods can enhance it even further, and if you're playing on Xbox, that's just not an option. The game is still a certified classic and a very influential role-playing game, but it's definitely aged. So for this entry, I have a double header. I have Shenmue 1 and 2. Now, I love the Shenmue series, call it a guilty pleasure, but there's just something about these two games that really captivates me, and I just found myself becoming fully engrossed in them. Even with that though, I would not say that these games have aged well. Nearly every aspect of Shenmue 1 and 2 has not aged well, and I wouldn't be surprised if modern gamers went back and tried this and just absolutely hated it. Like, outside of the music and the graphics, every aspect has not aged well, from the gameplay to the storytelling to the voice acting to the pacing to the combat, and especially the endings. Like, this game has a wonderful atmosphere, and graphically it looked amazing for the time. It even looks good nowadays. The music is also just really great in this game, especially Shenmue 2. I love the music in Shenmue 2, but this gameplay is, for lack of a better term, just so 90s. Like, the game, it moves at a snail's pace. And I'm not talking about like the controls or the movement here. I'm talking about the pacing of the game. Like, everything takes an eternity to do. Like, this is a 5-hour game stretched out over 20-25 hours. It just takes forever to do anything. And the same applies to Shenmue 2, if not even more so. It's a just massive game that will take you a very long time to get through, and that's because, again, it just really takes its time on everything. Gathering clues, investigating, talking to people, it's all just very slow, and it has no problem feeling as monotonous as possible. It knows it's slow too. Like, take the first game for example, when you have the forklift job, you have to do 7 in-game days working as a forklift driver. This is not fun, this is not engaging, it gets pretty dull pretty fast, and you gotta do it for like a solid hour. And then in the second game, nothing is straightforward. Your most simplest of tasks will be just completely discombobulated into like 5 different tasks. Like, when you have to find a certain bird in a building, all of a sudden there's like tons of birds, different floors, you gotta talk to people, everything just gets stretched out. But the pacing isn't the only issue here. The gameplay hasn't aged all that well either. There's just not a lot to it. I mean, you just walk around talking to people or investigating areas. It's slow, it's not the most exciting, and I can see why people wouldn't care for it. I actually enjoyed getting really engrossed and sucked into this world, but it's not hard to see why some people would just be like, what is this? This is boring and stupid, and the voice acting sucks. Yeah, the voice acting is not very good in this game. It's super compressed, and it's not exactly high quality. The writing isn't anything great either.
Years ago, I was Chinese. Now, I'm a naturalized Japanese.
The gameplay can get very stale and old rather quickly, and it doesn't change in Shenmue 2 either. It basically is the same, just with some new mini-games. And gambling. Way too much gambling in Shenmue 2. The combat isn't awful, but it hasn't aged all that well either. It uses Virtua Fighter's combat system, which isn't horrible, but it's not easy to pick up and understand, and it will take a little bit of time to get used to. Shenmue is definitely an acquired taste. It's not for everybody, and I wouldn't expect everybody to enjoy it. It's poorly aged aged in several aspects, but despite all of that, I really do love the games, and I think it is worth trying if you like the Yakuza series or are looking for something different. Just be very aware of what you're getting into. And so here we have a bit of a newer game. We have the original Assassin's Creed, and I'm sure there are plenty of people that are like, really? You're out here talking about like N64 and Super Nintendo games and you're gonna throw the original Assassin's Creed in there? Yes, I actually am. While I think the original Assassin's Creed has certainly aged better than several other games on this list, if you compare it to like any other Assassin's Creed game or several other Ubisoft open world games, it really does show its age, and it shows how far open worlds have come, especially in the Assassin's Creed series. The game is still decently playable nowadays, the story's still good, Altair is a good character, and this game just has a very distinct, unique atmosphere that none of the other AC games really have. Despite that though, this game has plenty of aspects where you can look at it and go, yeah, that hasn't aged all that well. For instance, the parkour, it's not as refined or good as the other AC games. It's actually kind of awkward, and it's way more finicky than like any of the other AC games where you'll find yourself just climbing the wrong thing or doing the wrong action. That happens in like every Assassin's Creed, but it happens way more in this game, and I get it. It was the first one, they were still figuring things out. That's totally fine. It's just when you come back to it, yeah, it takes a while to get used to the parkour. The combat, it's also pretty basic, not really much different from AC2, to be honest. It's just fine. I would say the movement in general is a bit more sluggish than like really any other AC game. Another big area where I feel like the original Assassin's Creed didn't age all that well is the structure and just how repetitive it gets. And it's funny because if you look back at old reviews of the game, people even lambasted it back then for being repetitive and kind of dull. But if you've played really almost any other Assassin's Creed, you'll immediately see just how repetitive this original game is, where it really is go spy on the target, gather information, and take them out. And of course you gotta go to the bureau over and over and over, and occasionally you'll have to run from authorities, but this gameplay loop just feels so uninspired so fast. The targets are not all that different or interesting from each other, they're not memorable, and they kind of all just mesh together. The story really doesn't do all that much until the end of the game. Like, the atmosphere is great and Altair is cool, but not much is happening, especially with these targets, and there's just virtually no variety here. All of the other Assassin's Creed games have plenty of variety where you're either, you know, following someone, you're taking somebody out, or you're on a pirate ship doing some crazy shit, but not this game. It really is just incredibly basic when it comes to its variety and mission types. Despite all of this, Assassin's Creed obviously went on to be a major franchise, and the second game really addresses all of these issues, and it's aged wonderfully. But that original AC, it is a little rough to come back to, especially if you've played any of the later games. Like, I'm not saying it's unplayable or the worst thing ever. It's not even the worst Assassin's Creed. I'd still rather play this than Unity. I'm sure that's a hot take, but this video is full of them. I'm just trying to say the original Assassin's Creed, it might not be as refined as you remember. And so here we have Twisted Metal, the original game on the PS1. Now this was like a PS1 launch title, and so, you know, you want to give it some slack for being such an early 3D game, but if you come back to this game nowadays, oh, it's rough. This game is very chunky, and its gameplay really has aged. And this is coming from someone who also really loves the Twisted Metal series, especially Twisted Metal 2, which also is pretty chunky, but I don't think it's aged as poorly as the original game. I mean, since we're talking about chunks, we might as well bring up the presentation. Yeah, this is a very ugly game. The environments are ugly, the cars are ugly, the cutscenes, they're not even cutscenes, they're screens of real life people. The graphics are just not very good, and it really fuels that argument that Super Nintendo games have aged better than PS1 games graphically because pixels look better than primitive 3D, and in this case, yeah, I agree. This game, again, it's just an ugly game, but is the gameplay still good? The gameplay is still alright. I never thought the gameplay was great in the original Twisted Metal, and I thought that Twisted Metal 2 really refined things, but I mean, it's still a car combat game. How do you mess that up? Well, the controls are very rough and imprecise. In fact, I would just say they kind of lean on the side of bad. I mean, they somewhat turn like tanks, it feels like, and it just doesn't have a nice feel to it. There's no sense of speed, and really, it feels as janky as it looks. Obviously, there's not a good way to describe controls if you haven't played the game. Just know that, yeah, it looks janky and it feels janky as hell. And when it comes to the actual car combat, you pick up some power-ups and you destroy each other. It's not riveting stuff here or the most innovative premise, and this isn't the best car combat game on the PS1, not by a landslide. The maps are a little too big, the power-ups are a little too far apart, you take too many hits, and some of these battles can just kind of drag on. It really can feel like a chore at times and just stop being fun. The AI are also pretty difficult to go up against. Usually they'll just team up against you and it feels like you're fighting 5 cars at once as opposed to them all fighting each other. And they really do know the ins and outs of the map, especially once you get towards the end of the game. It's actually quite a difficult game. On top of the not great controls, yeah, it's just kind of a recipe for disaster. At least the multiplayer is still fun when the frame rate isn't just totally dying again. It's a very ugly game, and it can actually be kind of difficult to see. The draw distance just isn't amazing. And look, if you're gonna play a Twisted Metal game these days, you're probably not gonna boot up the original game, especially not in original hardware. I'd recommend most Twisted Metals over the original. Like, it's a classic, it started the series, but coming back all these years later, it's a little painful. I still had fun with it, it's just I'd really rather play Twisted Metal 2. And so here we have it, the original Street Fighter. Now, out of the 20 entries on this list, this is the only one that I don't think is good. I don't think the original Street Fighter is a good game, and it's been just absolutely obliterated by time to the point that it really just is not worth playing. Now, we all know the Street Fighter series. It's probably the most influential series of fighting games, just this huge legacy, beloved characters and games, and this original game really was like the first fighting game of them all. There was no blueprint, there was nothing established here, and it absolutely shows because this game is just terrible. If you want to see a game just get absolutely hammered by time, you look at the original Street Fighter. This might be like the worst aging game of all time, outside of NES games. Like, it is straight dookie and it's a terrible fighting game. Everything that you could imagine that would be bad about an old fighting game is here. The controls are awful, doing combos and special moves are awful, the balancing is awful, the single player is terrible, multiplayer is not really good either. The presentation, it's actually pretty decent there. It did introduce a number of iconic characters to the series, but Street Fighter 2 introduced way better and more characters. Like, this game just gets absolutely obliterated by even Street Fighter 2. It's just a terrible game. And I'm not even sure for the time people thought this was good. I actually would rather play the original Fatal Fury over this. I don't think that game's very good, but it's better than this. This is just painful. It's so stiff and it feels terrible, and the fighting is just so unbalanced. Like, this game is genuinely one of the worst fighting games I've ever played, which is sad to say, but again, you gotta realize there was no blueprint, they had no example to go off of, they were pretty much in the dark here trying to do their own thing, and for that, they did a fantastic job and would really improve things later. But looking back all these years later, yeah, this game is absolutely not worth trying at all. If you want to see how bad a game can age, you look at Street Fighter 1. So for this entry, I don't just have one game, I've actually got several games on here. It's really all of the PS1 Tomb Raider games. Now, I never really messed around with the Tomb Raider series. It wasn't until that new classic collection came out and I went, yeah, these original Tomb Raiders, they haven't aged all that well. Like, they're still incredibly iconic classics and some of the best games on the PS1, but these have not aged all that well when it comes to several different aspects. I think the atmosphere is still great, the tone, the story, and I think Lara Croft is still awesome. I mean, Lara Croft would go on to be one of the most iconic video game characters ever, but when it comes to the actual gameplay, it has not aged well in several aspects. And it really doesn't matter which Tomb Raider you're playing on the PS1, they all kind of suffer from these issues. Some of them definitely suffer more than others though. When it comes to the controls, yeah, it's just kind of a pain in the ass. I mean, tank controls aren't the worst thing in the world. I don't have any of the original Resident Evils on here because I actually kind of like tank controls, but in this game, it takes a long time to get used to. It is a steep learning curve, and while this control scheme definitely works with Tomb Raider's level design, that doesn't mean it's any less clunky or a pain in the ass. Platforming has always been a challenge in this series. I mean, it doesn't really matter which game, there's plenty of jumps where you need to be like perfect. You need to be super precise, and you'll find yourself trying again over and over because you need to make such a precise jump. And this of course is compounded from the controls. The combat is not great in these games either. I like in the original that there really isn't that much combat because it's not the series' strongest suits, at least not for the original few games. Like, it's really clunky like the rest of the controls, and it's just incredibly rough. It's not really intuitive, and I didn't find this ever really fun, to be honest. And then the last thing to bring up is pixel hunting. Yes, this game has plenty of puzzles and you need to find items and use them elsewhere, and sometimes they're just hidden in the most obscure locations, and it's just like, how How on earth was I supposed to find that? How was anyone supposed to find that without just looking all over the place or, you know, a walkthrough? Just typical 90s game shit where they expect you to look in every corner, every pixel, you gotta hunt everything down, and it can just take a bit of time, or you just break out the walkthrough like a normal person. The original Tomb Raider games are still good, and they still have plenty of merit. We all love Lara Croft, and I think if you're able to look past some ancient game design and controls, you're probably gonna really like these older games. And so our next game is Mafia 1, which came out in the early 2000s, and it's funny because back then people said, oh, this is just a GTA 3 clone or ripoff or heavily inspired by GTA 3, and all these years later, I think the reason that Mafia 1 has poorly aged is like the same reasons as GTA 3. While this game does have plenty of good things about it, like the story, the characters, the writing, the atmosphere, the music, and even the setting, this game has plenty of areas that just kind of shit the bed, especially if you play it nowadays. And I'll just be real, it's all the gameplay. Really every aspect of the gameplay has not aged all that well, some of it much worse than others. Unlike GTA 3 where I can still compliment the driving, I can't compliment the driving of Mafia 1. Sure, you're driving old ass cars and maybe they wanted to replicate just how bad it was to drive them, but the driving is not good in this game. It does not feel nice, it's not intuitive, it's very clunky and slow. How many times have I said clunky in this video? Well, this is clunky. I don't like the driving in this game. I think it feels like ass. And then they make you do chases in the car, and that's kind of a pain in the ass, but then you have to do the race in the soapbox car. The race in the soapbox car is the worst mission in the entire Mafia series. It is awful. It is incredibly difficult. It doesn't handle well, and it turns out most people never actually got past this mission. It was just too difficult, and it felt incredibly unfair, and I don't blame them for giving up. It sucks. This mission was awful then, and it's awful now, and the controls really don't do it any favors. When you're on foot, the controls really aren't any better. The combat is just not very good. It's even worse than GTA 3's, and it feels like you can just get wiped out in seconds. And then, of course, like GTA 3, the checkpoints are terrible, so you have to restart over and over. Like, Mafia 1 is a hard game. I don't know if it was supposed to be this hard, but it certainly doesn't feel like the fair kind of hard. It feels like the kind of hard where it's just hard because it's poorly designed. The controls aren't intuitive, the driving sucks, the missions aren't great, and the enemy placement is it's just not really fair. I wouldn't say Mafia 1 is a bad game these days, but you certainly could make the argument. If you're going to try Mafia 1, try the remake. It's fantastic. It fixes literally everything I just said that sucks about the original, and it might be the best Mafia game of them all. It's just a really faithful, amazing remake, and it makes this original game kind of obsolete. And sometimes it's okay to leave the older games in the past. Leave them in the past. It didn't age well. We've got a proper remake that is just really stellar all around. And so here we have Witcher 1. Now, I love Witcher 2 and I really love Witcher 3. That's one of my favorite games of all time. I played Witcher 3 and then I went, I'll go back and I'll play Witcher 1 and 2. I tried Witcher 2, thought it was pretty good, and then I went back to Witcher 1 and just went, oh, what is this? And I'll be totally honest, after a few hours, I dropped it and never looked back. I did not like this game at all, and I think the reason I didn't like it is because I do not believe The Witcher 1 has aged well. Well, I don't believe it's a bad game and I didn't hate it, I just think this game has some serious flaws. I think the story, the characters, the writing, and the atmosphere are all very good. The game still looks good also. With a lot of these games, the story is usually pretty timeless. Same goes for the aesthetic and the atmosphere. Witcher absolutely falls under that. It's the gameplay. The gameplay of Witcher 1 is where things just do not hold up here, and it's funny because even back then, people weren't digging the gameplay then, and I'll just get right into it. It's the combat. The combat in this game sucks. With the 3 stances, it just feels super clunky. It's not fun. It's not intuitive. I never found this engaging, and everything Witcher 2 and 3 does is so much better than this, and people argue that the combat is clunky in those games. Like, if you think Witcher 2 or 3 feels incredibly floaty or like ass, you try Witcher 1. Witcher 1's combat with the stances and just the abilities, it just does not come together. I was not having fun with this. I did not enjoy this, and I wanted to do anything in the game besides combat. I don't think it's aged well. I'm not sure if it was good then. The combat just drags this game down so much for me, and that's really why I did drop it. When it came to the level design and the world design and the side quests and all of that, it seemed kind of generic and not really anything special. I mean, it was rather linear. So was Witcher 2 actually, but It's not like it aged absolutely horribly, it's just that combat just sucks. Like, man, oh man, that and the interface just isn't all that intuitive. I don't think the interface is aged all that well either. That's just kind of a minor gripe. At this point, I can't recommend you go play Witcher 1 because they're actually remaking the game. I think this game desperately needed a remake. I'm very excited to see how it turns out. I know this game can be great, and the remake's going to allow that. Wait for the remake, check it out then. But in the meantime, of course, play Witcher 3, one of the greatest games ever, yada yada yada, you already know it. So for this entry, I got the original Alone in the Dark trilogy. Now, it seems most people forgot that there even is an Alone in the Dark 2 and 3, but there is actually, and I don't think they've aged particularly well. I don't think the first game has aged all that well in certain aspects either. Now, when it comes to survival horror games, Alone in the Dark wasn't the very first one, but it really is the grandfather of modern survival horror, and then Resident Evil, of course, showed up and stole all of its thunder. But if you play the original Alone in the Dark, you'll immediately see that, yeah, it basically was Resident Evil years before, where you're in a spooky mansion, fixed camera angles, tank controls, inventory management, and of course some scares. But there's also combat. Now, the original Alone in the Dark, I think it's got a great atmosphere and it's got a solid enough story, but I mean, just look at it. The graphics haven't exactly aged well. It's primitive shapes out here, and the moment you get into combat, the game just absolutely falls apart. The combat is awful in this game. And one could argue, oh, it's a survival horror game, you're not supposed to get into combat, you're supposed to just run past them. Well, I hate to break it to you, the last third of the game puts you in a ton of combat. It's the weakest part of the original Alone in the Dark. I love the original Alone in the Dark. I still think it's a good game, but I'll be the first to admit that, yeah, the combat has not aged well at all. When it comes to the second game, well, this game just hasn't really aged well at all. I mean, they focus primarily on the combat, which was the worst part of the first game, but they didn't really fix it either. So most of the game is just this awful combat that's incredibly clunky, stiff, hard to control, unintuitive, difficult, shallow, and just frustrating. I hate the combat in the second game, and there's just way too much of it. The puzzle solving has not aged all that well either, and it's a lot more obtuse and annoying than the first game, which I thought the first game actually had really good puzzles that have aged well. At least graphically, it does look better. And then when it comes to the third game, the puzzles, again, just haven't aged all that well. There's some really annoying ones where it's like, okay, how on earth was anybody supposed to figure that out? Like when you got to blow up the door handle, that one is really annoying. The combat still sucks. It has not aged well. Thankfully, there's not that much of it. Instead, what you get is platforming. Yeah, there's platforming in this game, and it's as bad as you'd expect. Just really awkward, fidgety, and it doesn't really work with fixed camera angles. Then again, now that I think about it, platforming's actually in the first game as well, and it sucks there too, so why would they even bother? You know what? It is what it is. These games are kind of all over the place with the quality. I mean, the first game's a classic, the second game not so much, third game, it's okay, and if you like survival horror games and like classic older ones, I think you're going to enjoy it, but I just have a really hard time imagining a modern gamer, like someone who didn't grow up with these games or someone who doesn't appreciate older games, trying these and actually liking them. There's just so many things holding them back because they haven't aged well. The combat is very prevalent, it sucks, the puzzle solving can be annoying and obtuse, and the graphics, even for the time, are lacking. At least the music is pretty good. I love this series, but yeah, it's pretty hard to go back and play the old ones. Okay, so here's one you're either going to totally agree with or really disagree with. We have the original Pokemon Red and Blue, like the Game Boy games. Now, these games have been remade several times over. There's the Game Boy Advance versions, there's the Switch versions, and all of those versions are way better. But if you go back and try the original Game Boy versions, I don't think they've aged all that well. Especially if you've played legit any other mainline Pokemon game. You'll immediately find that while these games have a ton of charm and personality, and they do resemble what the Pokemon series is, you'll find that they're way more dull, slower, annoying, and not as much fun. Like, obviously Pokemon is just this blockbuster, legendary franchise, and this game did inspire what the rest of the series would be about, and it established all the fundamentals here. I'm not doubting that, and for the time it was just a revolutionary game, but if you come back to it nowadays, yeah, I don't think it's aged all that well. The game is very slow, even compared to the other Pokemon games. The text moves super slow, the battles aren't as exciting. I don't think the level design was anything special, even for the time, and I think the remakes make these levels a lot more exciting. They make the battles a lot more exciting, they add in the other type, and at the end of the day, the original Pokemon games can just feel a little shallow. And of course, you know, you could go, oh, it's just a zoomer coming back and shitting on the old games, but I think that even the second generation of Pokemon is far better than this original game. I think they improved a lot there. They added not just more Pokemon, but they made the world a lot more interesting. There's better level design, the battles go a lot faster, there's just more going on in them, they feel more dynamic. Pokemon Gen 2 I think is way better than Gen 1 when it comes to the games, and this original game is just rather crusty, and at times it feels like a chore to come back to. Again, I really recommend you just play the remakes. The remakes just fix like everything with those original games, but if you want to be a purist and go and play the Game Boy games, I think you're going to have a bit of a rough time. And so here we have another fighting game. I promised the last one for the day. We have the original Virtua Fighter. Now the original Virtua Fighter was like the first 3D fighting game of them all, and it certainly looks like it. While it absolutely was innovative and a revolutionary concept to have a fighting game that was in 3D, I mean, just look at it and tell me that this is aged well. When it comes to a presentation standpoint, yeah, the original Virtua Fighter, really the first like 2 Virtua Fighters, have not aged well. They're just really primitive blocky shapes fighting each other with some very odd facial animations. Obviously, this is very reminiscent of the time and we can look back and laugh at it, but at the time this was considered revolutionary and people were like, wow, it's in 3D and it looks so good. But thanks to this magical thing we have known as hindsight, we can see that, yeah, it doesn't exactly look great nowadays and it has not aged well when it comes to the graphics. But that's not the only area where Virtua Fighter has not aged very well. The controls, I mean, what do you expect at this point? The fighting does not feel nice. It feels incredibly clunky and stiff. It feels actually rather janky a lot of the time. Doing any kind of combos or special moves is just a pain in the ass. The AI can just absolutely whoop your ass because they can low-key button read you. While the game tries to be technical, it just doesn't come together. I guess maybe it was too ambitious for the time. Obviously, like Virtua Fighter 3 and especially 4 and 5 really come together to be a solid technical 3D fighter, but the original game, no. It is just very rough to come back to, and I have a hard time recommending it to anybody. Like, if you really do love old fighting games and you can put up with how stiff and awkward it feels, then yeah, you could go ahead and try this, but the simple truth is, just go play Tekken. Tekken came out not long after and it just destroys Virtua Fighter in my opinion. It feels amazing, it still feels amazing, looks better, and it's still relevant nowadays, which I don't know if I can say that about Virtua Fighter. I'm hoping we get another Virtua Fighter one day in the future, but it's never going to come close to Tekken. Come on now, it's Tekken. So the last game we're going to be talking about today is another classic. It is Donkey Kong 64. Now it's well documented that Donkey Kong 64 just has way too many collectibles, and honestly this is the main reason why I think DK64 has aged poorly. Like, I think the game has a great presentation, excellent characters, the music's awesome, and it just has a certain charm and atmosphere about it that you really can't get with any of Rare's other 3D platformers, but when it comes to the core gameplay, yeah, the collectibles and structure of this game make it not age well. I thought about several 3D platformers for this list: Mario 64, Crash, Spyro, Banjo-Kazooie, but to be honest, I think all of them have aged pretty well. Even Crash Bandicoot 1 with how simple it is, but Donkey Kong 64, man, the collectibles and the structure of this game really just date it and make it feel even older than it actually is. There's so many collectibles. I get it, you know, collecting things is a big part of these games, but this game just goes out of control, and then there's a bunch of just straight up short-sighted game design decisions, like not being able to switch Kongs whenever you want. You have to go back to the pad. This just makes the game take forever. It really adds to the tedium and repetitiveness, and going back and forth to then get a few bananas or get a golden banana or some other collectible, then you got to go back to the pad, switch again over and over and over. It's just ridiculous. These pads aren't all over the place either, so it really just adds to the tedium. On top of this, there's just tons and tons of mini games in this game, and I'll be real, a lot of them have not aged well. Kind of like Conker's Bad Fur Day, some parts of this game just suck. The mini games can just fuck right off. I've hated these ever since I played them when I was younger, and I don't think they've aged well in the slightest. Usually the controls are terrible, the AI is all over the place, or it just seems poorly designed to begin with. And coming back all these years later playing this, I'm just like, man, I forgot how much I just truly hate this. And all of this can lead to a somewhat negative experience. I still think Donkey Kong 64 is a classic. It has a ton of great things to it, but man, that structure where you just got to collect so many things, do so many awful mini games, it really does make it hard to recommend, especially if you don't care for 3D platformers or collectathons. Then I don't think you're gonna like the game. I still like the game all these years later, but man, I'm very hesitant to honestly ever play it again. And there you have it, some poorly aged games.
And that's it for today's video. If you made it to this part of the video, comment Christmas. That's our secret code word. You'll get a heart from me. We're less than 6 months away, I think, from Christmas now, getting closer and closer. I'm gonna go find out what else is poorly aged. It turns out these granola bars can poorly age. Incredible stuff. I might have to do a video on it. See ya.